Hi, Taras Pluskin here at the Top Shelf Aquatics Farm. Now, in my humble opinion, as a casual swimmer in the water, going out fishing, certainly taking care of aquariums, and certainly when looking at things through the lens of an aquaculturist, there's few more things, either in the wild or even in a tank, that is as majestic and relaxing to me as watching the grazing behavior of a tang, watching the grazing of a member of the Acan 30. For that reason, we're going to be continuing our little mini series today on the Acan 30, and we're going to be going underneath the hood when it comes to some of these tanks. We're going to see what actually makes them tick, and we're going to try and translate what makes them tick and how their guts are structured and how their guts work with what they need to eat, what they might be eating in the wild, and then trying to translate that into what foods are available in the reef aquarium hobby and what strategies we can use with the foods that are available to keep our tangs fat, happy, healthy, and beautiful. Tangs, long story short, are a lot more complex when it comes to their grazing and feeding behavior than something that is an abject carnivore. We can understand the grouper sitting on the reef. The grouper, another member of the Serenity, it's looking around looking for that one big meal for the next couple days or a week. It's going to grab that meal, and that meal is going to be a smaller fish most likely. It's going to be something very grouper-like. It's going to cook down that meal and turn all that fish tissue into grouper tissue. Very simple conversion. The tangs are not like that, and it's for that reason that they have some of their most interesting value in the reef aquarium industry because they function as cleanup crew. They eat algae and to a lesser extent some detritus, but it also presents a very nuanced challenge in the reef aquarium industry. Unlike a grouper or a clownfish, a tang cannot often just be thrown into an absolutely clean new aquarium. Even if the water quality is right, even if the flow is right, the light conditions, everything is correct, that tang could very well still starve to death, even if it's been continuously eating, quote unquote. One of the things that's most complicated when it comes to assessing the perfect diet for tangs is confronting a few immediate realities. The first of which is that any one of these tang species you see behind me, or any one of the wonderful tang species you see in our TSA farm, each one of them ate a completely different diet. When it was a microscopic plankton, a fish larvae, it was eating copepods, ciliates, all these micro zooplankton, eventually working its way up to krill and other larger, smaller crustaceans and the like. And then when it was an adult, and it was able to travel long distances, and it was able to move as a school and as a large group of tangs from reef to reef, forage ground to forage ground, it probably underwent a completely different dietary shift where it started to eat the algae that were more available to where it could travel. This can represent some pretty dramatic differences. For instance, members of the Nasini, like the unicorn fish, are quite adept at eating jellyfish and other gelatinous zooplankton. It becomes a very important part of their diet in the wild, versus some of the acanthurids that we enjoy in the hobby, frankly, are a little bit more of a true omnivore slash herbivore once they reach their adult state. So trying to tease out the differences between what might be happening between the time that each individual tang is born to the time that it might be introduced to our aquarium and being introduced to the first captive feeds that we're giving it, there's a lot of different nuances there where a certain tang may or may not be able to convert itself over to the diet that we present in captivity. So without further ado, let's spend the rest of this episode trying to explain and detail some of these wonderful different nuances when it comes to what unites the tangs as a whole as far as their gastrointestinal architecture, and then kind of sharing what we enjoy at the TSA farm when it comes to what keeps our tangs successfully well fed. As we've discussed in videos in the past, the diet that every individual species of fish is best at utilizing, be it an herbivore, a detritivore, or a carnivore, is directly represented inside the gastrointestinal architecture of that species. For example, we talked about that grouper that is eating smaller fish, cooking them down in a relatively big cardiac stomach to break down all that fish tissue into essentially the building blocks of that fish tissue. The grouper's intestinal system is just designed to pick up those building blocks and essentially give them right back to the grouper as the building blocks of that grouper's fish tissue. This is an extreme contrast to the Acan 30 and the Tangs, where we are more or less now discussing an herbivore. It is consuming algae, cyanobacteria, worms, things that are very unfish-like. The building blocks of these organisms, of this forage, are very unlike the tang. Therefore, it cannot directly just be cooked down and reconverted into tang and fish tissue. It must go through a series of intermittent factories. Factories that are able to take this very dissimilar forage and turn it into materials, building blocks, that the fish, the tang, can use. And these intermittent factories are the microbes. They are the gut microbes which occupy the tang's gut. It's this very, very, very long gastrointestinal, long intestine that defines an herbivore, because every single micrometer of that gastrointestinal tract is all habitat for very, very important gut microbes that are able to take that forage excreted by the stomach and convert it into the building blocks that the tangs can then use to grow and be colorful and healthy in the long term. So let's talk a little bit more about the actual microbes that are living inside this gut doing the action. Much like a cow, a tang is not necessarily eating its forage, it is eating the bacteria which eats its forage. And it is through this kind of tricky interlay that we can see where there are many avenues for a tang to be able to eat a wide range of forage, and also avenues for a tang to not be able to get nutrition if its availability of forage is interrupted or completely substituted with something of a different composition. A small larval tang will get everything it needs early on in life through those first few forage events on copepods and the like. That will allow the first bedrock, the first mayflower ships full of bacteria to colonize that baby tang, and hopefully once it achieves metamorphosis, it slowly can begin to acquire more and more microbes which will allow it to successfully forage on its second set of grazing items such as algae and the like. So we can see as that juvenile tang becomes older and older, there's infinite possibilities for empires, civilizations of different microbial communities to rise and fall as different abundances of different algae and different forages are presented to that animal as it gets older. There are many, many different microbes that occupy a tang. Some of these can be transitory, entering and exiting the tang. Others we know are a lot more intimately connected to tangs, and even specific genuses or genera of bacteria are strongly associated with this family of fish. Now, two sets of organisms are primarily important. The first are anaerobic fermenting bacteria that are able to occupy areas where there's minimal oxygen in the tang's gut and use that to ferment down these forage items into nutritional components that the tangs can use. The second set is also extremely important. These are the aerobic heterotrophic bacteria that are using oxygen made available through the tang's tissues to actively break down large organic compounds and make them available to the tang. And amongst these aerobic heterotrophic bacteria, there is one identified superstar. This is Euplopiscium, one of the largest bacteria known to man. The largest of cells can even be observed with a naked human eye. Now, Euplopiscium is relatively poorly understood, but what we do know is that it has a tremendous capability of being able to utilize a wide range of organic compounds, and it has a wide range of reproductive abilities. What this equates to is that the Euplopiscium cells can either mass reproduce and dominate a system when the appropriate forage is present, or it can enter a storage state and reside within the tang probably for long periods of time until it is needed again. Scientists are very convinced that it's the Euplopiscium which allows the tang to utilize, let's call it lower grades of forage, especially when that is the primary form of food that's available, and that this bacteria may take a sidestep to others once more premium foods are available. So this bacteria offers many wonderful avenues for explaining why some tangs might not do very well, why some tangs are able to survive and thrive off forage that is not very good compared to some tangs which suffer under much better forage, and it could also possibly alleviate and reveal an avenue for therapeutic approaches to resolve more nuanced long-term nutritional deficiencies in tangs and increase the overall survival of new naive tangs being introduced from an aquaculture and or wild-caught setting. So let's take all this microbiology gobbledygook and try and translate it into practical techniques and strategies that we can use to satisfy and take care of tangs in the captive environment, such as here at the Top Shelf Aquatic Coral Farm. So let's put some of the microbiology and some of the anatomy away for now, and let's talk about how tangs feed in the wild and how they feed in our tanks behaviorally. Well, tangs are grazers, as we talked about. So they're really depending on two general different types of feeding presence. The first is atmospheric feeding. This is when the tangs are going around their reef and their system. They're looking for algae that's growing on the rocks. They're looking for algae and different worms and copepods, amphipods, anything that's on the surface clustered up with all that new algae and biofilm growth. They're pretty much omnivorously providing all kinds of grazing pressure for this kind of continuous foraging. This is how we take advantage of tang behavior and feeding strategy inside the farm. Because of this continuous grazing pressure that especially our younger tangs deliver, especially those juveniles as they're rapidly trying to grow, they really are applying all this grazing pressure and therefore alleviating a lot of the algae problems that may kind of present an issue when it comes to our corals. Now, that's kind of atmospheric grazing, very important when it comes to housing these tangs. The other form of feeding they do is what you're seeing right here. It's opportunism feeding. Tangs, because of their gastrointestinal plasticity and the ability of all those microbes to convert all kinds of different stuff into nutrition, they can be really opportunistic once they have the right crew manning their ship. So, let's translate this into some realities and some tips when it comes to housing these tangs appropriately inside of any captive environment, be it your home aquarium or a productive SPS coral reef tank like this here at the farm. So, how do we entertain those two factors predominantly? Well, the first is that general feeding. We talked about that in some of our other episodes, especially the ones with light and spectrum. Certain spectrums of light and nutrients and flow, these three things contextualize the algae growth that you're going to be having inside your reef aquarium, such as this wonderful tank in SB here. We have high flow, relatively low nutrients, and high levels of mostly blue spectrum lighting. This facilitates algae, which is growing like a substrate and attached and sessile because of the high flow, otherwise it would blow away. The low nutrients are facilitating lots of fat buildup because this algae wants to store a bunch of fat because there's no surplus resources out there for the most part for it. And it's blue lighting, so that facilitates a lot of fat formation versus green and red lighting, which facilitate more carbohydrate metabolism. So, by being able to control light and nutrients, we really do guide the forage that's available to our tangs, and therefore all the different food that they're going to be eating in between these direct feedings we're going to be offering them. Now, these things are also in a restricted box. We don't have an ocean's worth of food to be giving them, and they don't have the luxury of swimming a few miles down to another reef to find better forage grounds. So this is where direct feedings are incredibly important, where yes, we set up an environment where the tangs can continuously graze and eat. We also give them direct feeding opportunities, preferably multiple times a day, to make sure that they're at least getting a good initial amount of forage for the day. We can see here, this is being done with some of our live Ogogracilaria from one of our refugiums. A wonderful way to take a bunch of nutrients, nitrates and phosphates, strip it out of our water, and then turn it into a usable food resource that we can then return to our wonderful animals here. Dried nori, porphyra, also wonderful. Great for humans, great for tangs, and has the luxury of already being industrially grown in many parts of Japan and China, and is commonly available in large dried out sheets that are very nutrient dense. Other options that tangs have are eating a variety of frozen foods where they don't have to rely on their microbiome as much. These are things like feeding them frozen mysis, feeding them pellets. We enjoy Hikari Seaweed Extreme and Benefet's pellets here. And all these are different ways to directly feed your tangs in between periodic grazing opportunities that they have here. So, I'd like to end this episode with a question. How long have you kept your tangs? What's the biggest tang you've ever seen in any aquarium? What was it eating? How old is it? By Analyzing all these different individuals, populations, species, genuses of this wonderful family, we really are teasing together different clues of how we can entertain a coral reef that's going on inside the guts of these wonderful tangs. Thank you. Please remember to like, subscribe, feed that algorithm like a hungry Naso tang slurping down some Ogo, and we will see you next time.